I hope you all had a good lunch. I think we better get started because it's already past 10 past 3, and every minute we lose now waiting for other people, we have to take time away from the presenters and the engaging discussion. So welcome to this. I don't think we should call this session of death. That's normally what you call this session after lunch, right, where people are digesting. But let's hope this is going to be very exciting. So what we are discussing at this session is entitled Spatial Inequalities and Ecological Transition. And my name is Jens. I'm Jens Christensen. I'm from the International Labour Organization. I know nothing about spatial inequalities, but I live in South Africa, so I live it every day and experience it every day. But I've been asked to chair this session, and so I tried to find out what is spatial inequalities, and those of you that are researching this absolutely know a lot more about it. But I actually, as many people do nowadays, put this into ChatGPT. Huh? So this is where you can improve what ChatGPT is saying. Huh? So I ask, how would you define the concept of spatial inequalities in the context of ecological transitions? And then it said, spatial inequalities in the context of ecological transition refer to disparities in the distribution of environmental benefits and burdens across different geographic areas. These inequalities can arise in the process of transitioning to more sustainable and ecologically responsible practices and policies. And it spoke about environmental benefits, environmental burdens, and then geographic disparities. And it said spatial inequalities often linked to geographic disparities, where certain areas or communities, especially those with fewer resources or political influence, are more likely to face environmental injustices. This may result from factors such as the location of polluting industries, the distribution of green infrastructure, and access to environmental services. So this is what we hope this is the definition from AI that perhaps our presenters can help us improve our understanding of. And what we have today in this session, we have 4 researchers with us. We have Arindam, who is going to talk to us. He's from the African Center of Excellence for Inequality Research, and he's on first. Then we have Ariane de LANNOY, also from UCT, who's going to give us a profile of youth and employment, education, and training. Then we have Joe GRÖTTE, also from the University of Cape Town, who's going to talk to us about a labor market index for South Africa. And then we have Heila SISITKA, who's sitting here, who's talking about spatial inequalities and ecological transition, actually the concept of our session. So I just want to invite Arindam to come up here and just tell you a bit about what Arindam is doing as an introduction. He is currently completing his doctoral research on inter-city spatial inequalities at the School of Economics here at UCT. He is trained as a quantitative economist and has been developing analytical frameworks for generating policy-relevant evidence across sectors in urban development. And his recent work lies at the intersection of spatial, environmental, and labor economics, exploring pathways to a sustainable and equitable urban transitions in cities of the Global South. And today he's sharing with us his research on spatial inequalities called Another Aspect of Spatial Inequalities, Different Climate Outcomes Within Cities. So, Arindam, the floor is yours. Give him a hand. Sorry, and I forget one thing. I'm not a very good facilitator. So hold your questions. I think to save time and make sure everyone gets each paper gets the same type of attention and time. Hold your questions, mark down your questions after each presentation. We are going to go through each presentation, and then we are going to have Patrick from World Data Lab be a discussion, and then we open up for questions. All right? Thanks, Arindam. Over to you.
Thank you, Jens. Just a quick thing. Yeah, cool, it's working. First of all, I think ChatGPT has earned millions of doctorates in the last couple of years for sure. Sometimes I wonder what's the purpose now. Anyway, so just to put some context into this particular research, is not exactly speaking to my doctoral work, but it's something that's happened in the peripheries of some work on cities that some colleagues and I have been doing at different cities around the world right now. I mean, basically around the global south right now. And what actually has happened has that there were suddenly some interesting results related to the climate impact in cities coming out from different parts of the world. And we felt that there is a strong case built for, ready-made for basically presenting the southern context in these things. So to begin with, I'm just going to show this particular slide is basically a map that I think a lot of people would have already seen. The image is basically trying to show us, like, what is the impact of increasing surface temperature on cities around the globe, and looking at it across the lower, across income categories, and also some specific regions are marked out. So basically, regions of interest basically being the tropical belt where most of the population lies, and sub-Saharan Africa and the India, China, Southeast Asia areas where we are expecting to see the next big jump of new urbanization, emergent urbanization. They might not seem like much right now because essentially the change in surface temperature over this particular period, 1975 to 2018, has not been that much in the tropics, more so in the temperate regions, as you can see. But if you multiply it by population, then the entire central belt over there, oh yeah, it works. Okay, so the entire tropical belt, that's where almost all world's population lies right now. And more importantly, they are all concentrated on the lower income and lower middle income categories. Now, what's happening is that we do know that, and there's enough evidence already, that geography is playing an important role. But how cities are constructed and how the characteristics, the physical characteristics of cities, plays an important role in the way the impacts of, well, rising temperatures and other things are visible. Just to continue, this is basically trying to show, the ridge plots over there are basically the variables corrected, sort of mapped to a sort of a z-score. So 0 shows the mean and then deviation across. What we do see is that surface temperature has been increased, the change in surface temperature over that period, 1990 to 2018, has increased across the board, but we see more of the lower income and lower middle income seeing a bulk of that increase. Similarly, population density, the increase in population density in that same period has been more in the lower income side of things. The other guys have been on the left side of that. Now, I'm looking at two different built form characteristics over here, and this is something that continue forward. Basically, compactness and greenness. Now, how is this defined? Compactness is essentially built up area per capita, and greenness is essentially tree cover per unit per square kilometer of built up. And what we see is that across income classes, there is a difference in the way built form characteristics, basically compactness and greenness, are related to surface temperature change. We do see that population density overall, which is that red bar, is consistently mostly positive, like it has a positive impact. So the denser the cities are, the more likely they are to exhibit increasing surface temperature, increasing this thing. We also see that what is consistently, the dark green that we are seeing, that's essentially the greenness. The how much green exists in the built environment. And what we are seeing is that built environment, and therefore the way the green component of green built environments kind of play out, is that it's always on the negative side. So the surface temperature change relationship with greenness is negative. So you are seeing a more green, lesser this thing, change in surface temperature. Now, that was the international sort of intercity kind of this thing. And then we came across, and this kind of led to this sort of examples that I'll be showing you from Cape Town, is that, thank you, is that within cities, and this came from the global north, basically, this is a set of work that's coming out of US cities. Within cities also, the quality of built form is strongly correlated with historical segregation. This is an example from New York, but this similar kind of thing has been worked out across across other cities of US. We realized that across global south, southern cities, we also have so much of spatial segregation, is some similar kind of trends visible. And here are some results from Cape Town. The short answer, of course, is yes. I know that my time is running out, so I'm just going to quickly run through this slide, and we can come back to it later as well. This slide is basically, this is the erstwhile group areas built up in 2022, which is 275, tree cover, and surface temperature change over the period 1990 to 2022. The data, the peak temperature that we're looking at is basically January average, which corresponds to Cape Town summer. I'm just going to run through a couple of trends. Most importantly, first of all, how has built up area changed? We're seeing that there has been a significant increase. It's gone from 202 square kilometers to 275 square kilometers. But the way it has increased is essentially around areas. So basically, concentration of built up has increased in the places that built up already was. So it's basically grown, there's been a sort of densification of built up in existing built up areas. And the same thing happens with tree cover as well. It has increased over time. 1990 to 2022, we have gone from 188 to 254. But if you see over here, the increase has happened in the same clusters where past green was. And this is basically surface temperature. And this is looking at the average peak temperature. The earlier thing was basically change, and this is the average peak. And first panel is basically 1990. This is 2022. And as you can see, it's like there have been certain areas in the map, basically going out into the Cape Flats and beyond, where you see changes at the grid level of up to 38 degrees Celsius. Sorry, up to 22 degrees Celsius. That's the actual temperature, up to 22 degrees Celsius change at the grid level. This is the change map. And again, immediate observation, the changes are happening strongly correlated with the growing built up area. And then this is the next thing that we wanted to I'm just going to highlight. This is this thing, and we can always come back for more discussions. Now, if we kind of split up the areas by erstwhile and contemporary forms of spatial segregation, I'm just going to be using two things over here. One is the erstwhile segregation in terms of group areas, contemporary in terms of where informal settlements exist right now, and all other areas, rather essentially all areas excluding informal settlements and group areas, right? So what we see is that, yes, there has been an increase in peak temperature. It has gone from 28.06 to 36.32 over the period 1990 to 2022. The change has been similar for historic group areas. It's gone from 28.83 to 36.53. But the stark change over here that we see is areas of contemporary segregation, which is essentially informal settlements, which has gone from 28.78, which is already higher than the baseline, to a 37.58. So the change has been significantly more for informal settlement, areas with informal settlements, which kind of gets us to thinking about what exactly is intercity variation, intracity variation being driven by. There's obviously the location, built form, tree cover, green infrastructure, all that matters. But what we are also seeing in cities of the global south, and this is something that we're seeing in other places as well, is that built form quality plays a significant role as well. So informal settlements, as you know, in South Africa, is you see the materials being used for buildings is basically corrugated iron sheets compared to, say, concrete in other places. And that itself is like creating these spaces where you have massive changes in peaks of summer temperatures. Why is this important? Well, essentially, it's there are obvious strong links with existing forms of other forms of socioeconomic and spatial inequalities that are being experienced in cities, because built form quality obviously is not happening in vacuum. I mean, there is a reason why people in informal settlements are building with the materials they're using. And so this kind of how different places within the city are experiencing different changes in surface temperature and sort of the heat effects plays a strong role in and has strong linkages with how people are kind of, living, where people are living and where people are working. And that's something that we need to be cognizant of when we are thinking of interventions nowadays in terms of cooling. Just going to close with another city that we've been looking at in our sample. There are other cities as well, but essentially the similar trend happens in other places as well. This is a city in India where you see that this being the red line being the peak summer temperature in formal settlements, significantly higher than other ones. Anyway, so I'm going to close with this and hand over to Jens.
Give him a round of applause. Fantastic, Arindam. Very, very interesting how people who live in the same city experience climate change and heat stress differently depending on the built environment. So let's move on. We are quickly sort of rattling through the various presentations. So now I would like to invite our next presenter, which is Ariane de LANNOY. She's an associate professor and chief researcher at the Southern Africa Labor and Development Research Unit, SALDRU at UCT. She has 20 years of research experience. Her work has had a consistent focus on youth and youth development in the complex context of post-apartheid South Africa, with extensions to work related to the rest of Africa. And she has a strong expertise in developing mixed method studies and leading multi-stakeholder projects. And she's currently working, you are one of the project leads of the basic package of support for young people who are not in education, employment, and training, the so-called NEED category. And she also leads the Youth Explorer project, I understand, that maps indicators on youth well-being alongside service provision of labor market information, and so on and so forth. So, and both of these two projects are part of one of the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention Initiatives. So she's going to share with us, which I understand is an annual update, a profiling of young people not in employment, education, and training in South Africa. So, Ariane, over to you.
Very intimidatingly high microphone. I have 12 minutes. Okay. I also feel a little bit sandwiched in between sessions that focus on ecological transitions, whereas my paper doesn't really speak about that. But we'll try and talk about, or at least I'll try and make a link to the just transition and the more vulnerable populations in that. I'm going to skip over the introduction and just dive straight in. So SALDRU runs an annual update on a profile of young people who are not in education, employment, or training, and we do that for various reasons. Firstly, because we know that there are huge numbers of young people who are NEET in between, in inverted brackets, so not connected to the labor market and not in education. And we know from the literature that those are some of the most vulnerable young people in the country. And our question is, well, if we don't fully understand what that cohort of young people looks like, then how are we going to properly plan and design interventions for these young people? That, I think, we think is relevant in the context of the just transition. So what are we looking at in South Africa? Much of this is very, very descriptive, and we'll go into more detail actually later on in some of Joe's presentation as well. We're looking at over 3.3 million young people between the ages of 15 to 24 who are out of the education system and out of the labor market. If we take the full definition of young people in South Africa into account, we're looking at over 9 million. When we use quarterly labor force survey data to understand whether that trend has seen any downward, whether there's been a downward trend in that situation, given the investment to try and do something about the youth unemployment situation and the connections to education, what we see is actually a steady increase in the proportion of young people who are out of education and out of the labor market. Comparing 2013 to 2023, we see an increase in 2023 to 33.3% of young people, and we see that young women are more vulnerable to this than young men. What is important to keep in mind is that this is a cohort of young people that isn't only out of the education system or only unemployed. They face many different kinds of vulnerabilities all at the same time. And so when we think about things as the just transition and we ask ourselves who is in already vulnerable positions there, and how do we plan for rectifying for that, the question is, or how do we plan for supporting these young people? The question is, what do we do for young people who are not connected to any of these systems? So I'll be talking you through quite a few tables, but just to give you a sense of the cohort that we are actually talking about and how things have changed over time. In the public discourse, very often when there is a conversation around young people who are not in education, employment, or training, the understanding is these are young people who don't want to work. They're young people who are floating around somewhere out of the systems, and why are they not connecting to any opportunities? The QLFS asks of people whether they are interested to work, available to work, and looking for work. Those are what we define as the strict group of unemployed people. 49% of these young people are unemployed, searching unemployed young people. An additional 20% of them are discouraged job seekers, but that means that they are still available to work and say that they want to work. And I think that this is really important, right? So we're looking at close to 70% of these young people who say they want to work. An additional 30%, sorry, my little thingy jumped to the wrong one, are inactive, and we see when we look at that separately that inactivity is mainly driven by young female caregivers, and I'll come back to that just now. Talking about geographical differences, we also very often think about, or we, the broader public, thinks about these young people that are disconnected as those who are in the more remote rural areas, but in fact what we see is that the majority of them live in urban areas. And what is also interesting is that the vast majority of them are out of education and out of the labor market with either less than a matric or a matric. What is important there is to note the difference over the last decade. While in 2013, it was still already a high proportion, 37% of young people who were NEET had a matric. We've seen that go up to close to 50% in 2023, which is something we really need to be thinking about more carefully, because what does that mean? We've for a long time seen that matric has had a protective factor in the labor market. Does that mean that matric is losing that kind of protective aspect? And then how do we plan for that? How do we begin to rectify? So as I said earlier, often discouraged job seekers are looked or considered inactive in the labor market. We've shifted things around a little bit. Because discouraged job seekers do still indicate that they want to work, we've included them in a category of young people that we consider having an orientation towards the labor market. And so when we look at the makeup of that subcategory, we see that over 50% of young people who have an orientation towards the labor market have been unemployed long term, and I'll come back to that in a little bit more detail just now. And of those who are inactive in the labor market, the majority are inactive because of caregiving responsibilities. But also interesting is that we see a shift to a higher proportion of young people who are inactive because of health reasons. Again, if you look at the 2013 data, you see that that's a significant increase over time. Of those who are searching unemployed, the question then is who are they? How do we figure out how to best reach out to them, how to best connect them to the labor market? Is this young people who are losing jobs, who are moving in and out of the labor market and in and out of connectivity to jobs? But what we see is that close to 80% of them are new entrants into the labor market. This means they have never worked before. So they're not only out of education and out of the labor market, they have not worked before. And we'll go into more detail on what that cohort then looks like, because often the term new entrant can give us the sense that this is a recent new entrant, right? So they've just kind of left the education system and they're now newly looking for a job. These are the numbers that kind of always blow my mind. Of those who are searching unemployed, new entrants, neat young people, the vast majority has been looking for work for more than a year. So 39% for more than 1 year, but an additional 42% have been looking for work for more than 3 years. So they have never worked before, they want to work, they have been looking for work for more than 3 years. And I think this is absolutely crucial, because what it points at is the absolute resilience and willingness of these young people to continue to engage in searches to connect to opportunities and the inability to do so. And we really need to ask ourselves what that does to young people's well-being over the long run. What is equally important, again, I'm going to keep pointing it out, is the change in this composition over the past decade. While we had 11.5% of young people who were neat, new entrants, unemployed in 2013, there's a statistically significant increase to over 21% in that category in 2023. Okay, I have 5 minutes, so I need to move on. We know that being unemployed for longer periods of time increases the risk of scarring and discouragement. We also know from the literature that being in that long-term neat state increases the risk of remaining trapped in poverty and increases the risk of depression. In other words, we're looking at a huge cost at the individual, family, and societal level of huge numbers of young people that have been excluded from the systems for an extended period of time. When we look at other disciplines, our colleagues at psychology have done quite a good job at trying to explain how this kind of long-term exclusion drives a vicious cycle of what they call social drift. So what you're looking at is young people who are in this kind of multidimensional poverty situation where they are out of the education system with low levels of education, long-term unemployment, and therefore many of them living in income poverty, and I'll show you the numbers on that just now. What that does is it increases levels of stress, it increases risk behavior, and a whole range of health factors, which ultimately increases the risk of mental ill health, and that in turn means that even when opportunities would be available, young people are less able and less supported and less resilient to take up the opportunities that come up. So really, when we think about planning for vulnerability and planning for risk going forward, we need to be thinking about how we can break that cycle going forward. Is there a pause button? Because I don't want this to jump straight away. What this is looking at is, or what it's emphasizing, is the need to understand what this cohort looks like at lower geographical levels. So what I just presented was a national profile of young people who are neat. What you're seeing here is the red and orange shaded areas are those where the proportions of young people who are neat are higher. The green areas are those where it is lower. But what is important is, for instance, to look at the composition of this cohort in the Western Cape, where we have higher proportions of young people with less than a matric being out of the education system and out of the labor market, compared to, for instance, Gauteng, where we see a higher proportion, close to 60% of young people who are neat have a matric. In other words, you're planning for a slightly different cohort. And this kind of differentiation in the profile continues as you go down the geographical levels. I know, I'll hurry up. We also see, for instance, in the Western Cape, higher proportions, significantly higher proportions being inactive, whereas in Gauteng, significantly higher proportions being unemployed youth, so searching unemployed. So again, those are the kinds of analysis we need to be looking at if we're beginning to plan for interventions that could make a difference. They need to be context specific and understand what cohort we are planning for. I'll be very quick with this one. So we also used general household survey data to look at the multiplicity of vulnerability, as I said earlier on. So of young people who are out of education, employment or training, according to the GHS data, which is where we draw the income data from, almost 70% of these young people in 2021 were living in income poverty, below the upper bound poverty line. Compared to 2013, there is an increase there too. I'm feeling the pressure. I think it was Murray who said earlier on, I'm going to be evicted. I'm feeling a similar situation happening here. But what is important, of those young people who are NEET and who are income poor, again, the majority remains searching unemployed, and the majority of them are out of the education system with less than a matric or a matric. Again, look at the shift in the less than matric there. I'm going to be very quick about this one. We ran a multivariate logistic regression to try and understand what the contribution then is of a number of these individual and household level factors to young people being NEET. And I think that this is important because we heard Jackie speak earlier on about young people and higher levels of vulnerability of those who are in the labor market. And we see similar trends here. I'm just going to point it out. But the probability of being NEET among young people is increased significantly by being female, being married, having children under the age of 7, and living in income poverty. You also see the urban dimension there that is playing a role. So again, we see a similar vulnerability profile in this analysis than the one that we saw, I think, earlier on in the presentations this morning. Okay, I'm done. Wow.
Thanks a lot, Ariane, and thank you for staying within the time. You know, we've given each presenter 12 minutes, and I'm sorry, you know, we have to pack everything into the 1.5 hour, and we started a bit late, and I know we could spend a whole day on each topic and each paper. Huh? So let me hand over to Joanna GRÖTTE. She's also from the SALDRU, and she holds a PhD in economics at UCT and also joined SALDRU research team in 2018. Her expertise is in the development of multidimensional indices, complementing the Youth Multidimensional Poverty Index and Youth Labor Market Index work. And I understand you're working together with Ariane, and here we had a bit of the analysis, and now you're going to tell us what to do about it, right? No, not exactly. So she is sharing with us research on developing a Youth Labor Market Index for South Africa at the subnational level. And I think you've co-authored that with a number of people, so you can mention that yourself. Over to you, thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. You'll see quite a few of us have contributed to this paper, and I can see 3 of them here. Unfortunately, not our lead author, so you have me presenting. So we developed a Youth Labour Market Index for South Africa at the subnational level.
Do you want to go? Like, you don't need to stand there.
Do I just hold it?
Yeah. No, I think then you can.
Oh, no, it's fine. I'll... Okay. So,
don't want you to crouch.
oh, there, okay.
Okay.
There we go. So, understanding the complexity of the youth labour market, particularly in developing countries, requires a multidimensional approach. And in light of that, we've developed the Youth Labour Market Index, or the YLMI, to profile the labour market situation of youth in South Africa, which is the 15 to 35-year-old age group. The index encompasses 10 indicators that are grouped into 4 dimensions. And there are 2 key factors that make an index more attractive than single indicators. So as we've said, the situation is complex and multidimensional in nature, and that's best captured by an index. And furthermore, the index can then be decomposed into the individual components to identify the areas where the greatest need is and that are having the greatest influence on the situation experienced by young people. Just to take a brief look at the youth employment situation in South Africa, as Ariane has shown us, youth are one of the most vulnerable groups in South Africa. 30.1% are engaged in school or post-school education programs. 25.8% are employed, and the official youth unemployment rate stands at 46.8% and the expanded rate at 58.3%. And the labour force participation rate for young people in South Africa is 48.5%. Ariane's just told us about NEET in great detail, so I'll skip through that. So the high levels of youth unemployment in South Africa are driven by a range of factors. These include low levels of education and skills, a shortage of jobs, as well as a mismatch between skills demand and supply, income poverty and high job search costs, transport constraints, connectivity issues, and a lack of social capital. Then even when youth are employed, they are disproportionately represented in precarious occupations and informal work. And these kinds of jobs are characterized by low wages, poor working conditions, and a lack of job security. So together, the high levels of unemployment and discouragement that we see, as well as the disproportionate representation of youth in these precarious occupations, perpetuate inequality in the labour market, which in turn contributes to greater overall income inequality in the country. Turning to the literature, there's a strong body of literature that incorporates multiple indicators into labour market indices for the general labour market as well as for youth. In particular, we follow the methodology and structure of the KOF Youth Labour Market Index, as well as the Youth Labour Index for low-income countries. These indices group 12 indicators into 3 or 4 domains that capture both the demand and the supply side of the labour market for youth. These include the activity state, working conditions, education, and transition. So these are the domains and indicators of the YLMI, which is developed using quarterly labour force survey data from 2013 to 2023. It's Q1 data. So within the first domain, the activity state, we include the unemployment rate, the relaxed unemployment rate, and the NEET rate. What you'll see is that each dimension is weighted equally at 1 quarter, and then the indicators within each dimension are equally weighted. The working conditions domain includes the informal sector worker rate, vulnerable employment rate, and elementary occupation rate. Transition, this is youth going from school to work. We have the relative unemployment rate, that's the working age population rate relative to the youth rate, the long-term unemployment rate. And then the final domain is education, where we have a skills mismatch rate, as well as the no secondary education rate that captures youth who haven't achieved matric. Very briefly, the indicators are normalized into a unitless score ranging between 0 and 1 so that we can compare them directly. The scores then within each dimension are summed within each province and each time period and using the equal weighting system that we saw in the previous slide. And then the full YLMI score is computed as the arithmetic mean of the 4 dimensions, again equally weighted. So the index ranges between 0 and 100, with 0 indicating a totally dysfunctional labour market and 100 reflecting a fully functioning labour market for youth. Okay, and straight to the findings. The blue line in the middle is the Youth Labour Market Index score for South Africa, which is alarmingly low at 16.8. Remember, the lower the score, the less functional the labour market. The index increased slightly over the period 2013 to 2015 and then decreased steadily from 17 in 2015 down to 15.5 in 2022. And in this last year, we've seen a small uptick in the index scores. We've also included here a gender component. The orange line at the bottom is the youth labour market for females specifically, which is consistently below that of males. And this is also reflected in what Ariane showed us earlier. in this image, we can see the contributions of each dimension to the labor market. So each domain was weighted equally at 25%. So what we see here is, for example, the orange domain, which is the working conditions. The proportions exceed the assigned weight of 25%, indicating that the working conditions domain has the strongest influence on the labor market scores that we see. So over the period from 2013 to 2023, roughly about 30% of the index is driven by the poor working conditions that youth face. And second to that is education, at about 25%. And then the transition and activity states are relatively lower, around 20 to 23%. Given that we're looking at spatial inequality, here we're looking at the rural and urban YLMI scores. Again, the blue line in the middle is the national scores that we saw earlier. And I'm sure not surprisingly, the rural labor market is persistently lower than that of the urban labor market. And I don't think that's a new story for anyone. And here we can see the provincial YLMI scores in 2013 relative to 2023. Again, not surprisingly, the Western Cape persistently has the highest scores. Remember, higher scores indicate a better functioning labor market. Mpumalanga had the poorest functioning labor market in 2013, and they're still second lowest in 2023, but actually the Northwest has the lowest YLMI score in 2023. What we're going to do now quickly is jump to the Youth Explorer. We have the YLMI scores mapped on the Youth Explorer. So we're just waiting to go to the portal. This is a joint project with Soldru and Open Up, and with a lot of support from the French Development Agency. Yeah. So this is the Youth Explorer, where we map various indicators of well-being across the country down to the small area level. And what we've got on here are the Youth Labour Market Index scores that we just discussed from 2023 down to 2013. And if we hover over the Western Cape, we can see there the YLMI score is just over 17, and the darker shade of red indicates the higher number, which again is the positive or better functioning labor market. And if we go up to the Northwest, the palest color represents the lower number, which is 15. What we can also look at on the Youth Explorer, we may think, what kind of services would young people who are searching for jobs need? And we can, for example, map Department of Employment and Labour centres across the country. And there we can see the distribution of labour centres. And if we click on one of them, yeah, and we click on more information, we've got a variety of information about this labour centre. Importantly, that this information was verified by the Department of Employment and Labour in 2021. We've got various details regarding contact information, as well as the services offered and when this particular Paternoster visiting point is open. For example, it's only open from 8:30 to 3 p.m. every first Friday of the month, which is very specific. 2 minutes, okay. I'm also, now that we're here, just quickly going to show you what Ariane was talking about. We've also mapped NEET youth. And just interestingly, to tie to Ariane's presentation, if we map NEET youth across the country, and we look at the Western Cape, which, if you remember, had the better functioning labour market, it actually has the lowest proportion of NEET youth. And conversely, the Northwest, that had the poorer functioning labour market, now we actually see as the highest proportion of NEET youth. So that's just one tiny way the Youth Explorer can be used to explore spatial inequalities. Yeah, can we? Oh, yes. So as I said, we map indicators of well-being at various geographic levels. So for example, if we click on the Western Cape, we can then see what we're looking at, NEAT. We can then see the NEAT data displayed at the district level, and we can click down even further. And the same NEAT data we now see at the municipal level. And we can go even further. And if we go to the rich data view, here within the municipality, we have all the main places. So the whole list of indicators in the left-hand panel here are all indicators of well-being based on census data that we map across various geographies for the whole country. This is also complemented by labor market data using the NT-SARS tax data. And then, as we briefly showed, we map a whole range of services as well across the country. Thanks. And you're welcome to explore the Youth Explorer. It is publicly available.
Wow, fantastic. Just on time, 12 minutes. And now, fascinating presentation. I hope you have lots of questions to this. I think it's mind-blowing, you know, this data you pull out there. So Heila is up next. She's a distinguished professor at Rhodes University and holds a Tier 1 South African National Research Foundation Chair in Transformative Social Learning and Green Skills Learning Pathways at Rhodes University. She holds a PhD in environmental education for sustainable development, transformative environmental learning, agency and education and skills system transformations, and she's sharing with us research called Moving Skills System Planning Beyond Human Capital Development Models in a Water Scarce Country. I hope that was correct. Over to you, Heila.
Thank you. Yes, my title in the program seemed to have just become the main one, but it is actually, just wondering how you work this. I want to talk a little bit about, I thank you very much for these presentations that have just come before me. I don't think I could have been in a better session, actually. How does this work too? Aha. Yeah, so I'm kind of from an education faculty, right? So I'm not an economist, so I don't model all these big things, right? So let me just start there. And what I'm really interested in and have been interested in for a long time is what do we do when the skills system is failing our young people, and what do we do when the labor market fails us and fails the majority of these young people, which is what we've just seen. And it's not only the majority of the young people that the skill system has failed and failing, it's also women in rural areas and the marginalized people. So that's kind of where I want to speak, and I'm going to speak from a couple of very practical examples of trying to work out what we can do when all of this, you know, data that we've all seen is the actual reality of people on the ground. So that's where I'm going to work from. And the focus of, I don't know why that little one is still showing there, but anyway, so the problem, yeah, can you get rid of it? No? No? Sorry. Yeah, I don't know how that got there. Wasn't me. Right, that looks better. Okay, so the problem actually is that the way that the skills system works is that it's often sector specific. And these sectors are being driven by the formal economy and its functioning and all of its affordances and so on. And most of the skills plans, as Prisha indicated this morning, are developed out of workplace skills plans and assessments. Now, what happens if you're not in a workplace and you're not actually in this formal sector system? What happens to you then? So what happens because of the way that the system functions is that it tends to lead to absences, quite significant absences in skills planning when it comes to particularly environmental issues, but also more broadly, as we've seen from the issues around the NEET, the issue of the NEET young people. So what I want to do here is just really use an example actually from working with water instead of energy, because I feel like so many people, when you talk about just transitions, talk about energy, and we forget about, you know, really crucial issues like water. In fact, if we didn't have water, we would have no economy, which people don't talk about a lot, but it is the truth. So I want to focus into water just to, you know, raise things from another perspective. And water must and is be part of the South African just transition. And we know that climate change has contributed towards more acute wet and dry seasons. We've seen flooding, we've seen droughts, we've seen these intensifying occurrences that are going on all of the time. And what this does is it intersects with all of these other issues: energy, food, infrastructure, climate resilience, and so on. And of course, water flows through landscapes. It touches every person, no matter where you are. So in some ways, it's one of the great equalizers. And it can give us a good place to focus if we really want to look at justice and where to start the work with the just transition. And we are a water scarce country already. All of our water resources are allocated. And water, I think another reason why it's quite interesting to focus on water is that it's less corporatized than energy and the energy transition. So it takes you into a different space when you start to think just transitions. Although even the US International Trade Administration has identified as part of their market intelligence that there is a freshwater crisis in South Africa, and this is like quite a big challenge for the economy. I won't go through all the detail of it, but we have both problems of supply. We also have problems of contamination or pollution. And we have an inadequate supply. Our water is already allocated. So we have a huge issue actually when it comes to water in this country. And you can get also differentiation around these issues of water, water scarcity. There's multiple factors: demand-driven scarcity, population-driven scarcity, climate-driven water scarcity, pollution-driven water scarcity. And the other one that's really interesting is economic water scarcity. And they talk about that as being, you know, coming from insufficient human capacity to manage our water, and then that this, in fact, will then further exacerbate poverty and inequality. So that's kind of linking to this conference theme. So the skills system, I think Prisha talked a bit about that this morning, is that the skills system, the current forms of skills planning, the way skills are planned for, the way that resources are allocated according to those plans, are inadequate for the scope and the scale of the kind of issues we're dealing with when it comes to not only water security, but also the other environmental issues in our country, including the energy transition, by the way. And that is because it's also characterized by lock-in, and it's a lock-in that comes with a particular conceptualization of skills and also work and what skills development is for. And most of that comes out of a history of colonial modernity and the Industrial Revolution, which drove a particular model of human capacity building, which got narrowed to what we call human capital, which serves only the market, skills for the market, skills for the economic sectors. And we also, at the same time, have these limitations in the skills planning instruments and multiple inefficiencies in the skills system, which Stephanie Allais, unfortunately, is not here, but she's done a brilliant analysis of those and why we actually need to completely transform the way that the skills system is functioning in the country. So the skill system generally is reactive and inefficient, and how do we break out of it, and how do we avoid lock into its trajectories and instruments? Where do we start actually to change the system? Instead of analyzing it, we actually need to find ways to change it, and that's what I'm really interested in. So what I want to do here is just to share with you two just really sort of like empirical examples, cases that we've been working on for the last 8 to 10 years, trying to look at if you think about skills development differently from the ground up, what would it look like? And that's what we are trying to do. And there's two things that we need to do in this country. Is we need to make much better links between the formal and the informal skills development systems, because informality is huge. You've just heard about the needs. Young people with matrics, how can they not be, be part of their societies and we just leave them out? We cannot afford to do that. Okay, so it's a lack of social imagination, I think, to some extent as well. And then we need to find ways to reframe skill system planning that can actually think about work differently. And I'm happy that Kate is here because we've been working a bit with her on that as well, with the DUCT program. So how do we deal with this problem if the skills system is overly generic, it's top down, the skills planning, when the issues that people are dealing with are emergent and they're often place-based and geospatially framed? And also complex, okay? So you have a particular style of planning, but the reality is almost the opposite. How do you deal with that, okay? So how do you then, develop a different kind of skills development planning? So it's really this problem, right? So this is the main model of skills planning, top down, sectors, companies. And then if you start from the bottom up and you don't only work with companies, what are you doing? You see, you're doing something very different. And so here's a good example. These are women who were given back their land in the former CHRISTENSEN area, no water. Okay, they're all keen on farming. There's local economic development support for farming. They've got farming associations and they have no water. And, we have the knowledge to provide ways and means of getting water to the land, but nobody really knew how to use that knowledge or share it or make it work, okay? So in this process, we developed an alternative model for skills development, which is a social skills ecosystem model in which we connect all of the different skills providers, and those are not only formal, they're also informal NGOs, TVET colleges, universities, schools, and so on, into learning networks, working with community media, and so on. And so just, it's a long story, this one, but just to give you a sense of, trying to connect working, living, and learning instead of just working and learning, but also in and through the living, and then trying to build these learning networks and build capacity amongst all kinds of organizations and groups to also take up peer learning and so on. I won't go into the detail of it, it's been written up. But this is the messy reality, right? It doesn't look like a table and it doesn't look like an indicator, but it is actually what happens on the ground when you're trying to develop skills. You're actually looking at these like quite complex relational networks with policies that are working or not working, and issues people are dealing with, and different partnerships and relationships and connections and programs and so on. And if we can't get to that level, we're not actually going to be able to develop the kinds of skills that we need to respond to these more complex issues. So this is the model. We're working on it together with Prisha and others, trying to articulate this, what we call social skills ecosystem for just transitions. And when you look at the just transitions discourse, it often talks about stakeholders and inclusive processes and linking them together and relationship building and so on, but we don't actually have the tools to do that well. Even reframing the way in which we are articulating issues in the skill system. We had presentations this morning about the occupation as the main focus. It's actually inadequate when we're talking about this thing, so we have to reframe that as well. 2 more minutes. Okay, so this is some of the research that we're doing. I won't go into it in further detail. We have published a book on it, one of the first renditions of this, looking across a couple of countries in Africa, trying to articulate some of the dimensions of that. It's still work in progress. We have more students that are working on this model, and hopefully in a couple of years' time we'll be able to make better directional recommendations to the skills system. The second one is this one. When we're planning and got our whole skills system, and it's focused on what I would call limited conceptions of work. And so it leaves out new ways of thinking about work and learning. And so we need to actually rethink what we mean by work, actually. And here's all the data about the youth that are unemployed. We've just heard it again. But we also need to think about the work. Work is defined mainly in terms of market and state. And we are failing to define work in terms of the common good and also in terms of household work. And so we can maybe do some work on rethinking economies. And there's quite a lot of work that's going on. People talk about people's economy. People are talking about circular economies and various other forms of economic thinking. And it seems to be hovering around the edges of mainstream thinking rather than coming into the center. And yet, if we want to accommodate everybody in a productive economy, we're going to have to change our thinking, because there's never going to be enough of those formal jobs that seem to be the ones that are going to service everybody, when we can see they actually aren't. So we've been working with this project, which was also funded by the PES for a while, to bring some of these young people into the possibilities of rethinking work for the common good and learning for the future. And this is one of the work streams that we've been trying to develop. And these are, by the way, if you want to look at a nice map, it's a map of the failed wastewater treatment plants in our country, which means it's where all the E. coli, to be polite, is running into our rivers, pretty much every single river in the country. We have a complete failure of monitoring capacity in the local government service, and yet we have all these young people with all of these skills and talents, and let's bring them in. So this program was about bringing in young people to learn citizen sciences, to monitor the rivers, and to be able to report to their communities and the local governments and to build these local networks. Fantastic project, Kate will tell you. Unbelievable. And just giving, you were talking about these young people looking for something and giving them a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning in life and being part of communities and doing something for the common good. It's an amazingly productive concept, actually, when we start to think about work for the common good. So here's other work streams that can be developed for work for the common good: sustainable food commons, growing more food in our communities. Again, we've got 11.8 million people that are in need of food, yet we can't grow food at a small scale level. This is our biodiversity and our ecosystems that are under threat. Other work streams that are possible to develop. This is the plastic on our beaches, 79,000 tons of plastic leaking into the environment every year. And then we say there's no work for people. So, for me, it's a question about making this work for the common good more viable and meaningful and accessible, and to think differently about how we think about economy, because some of the work on investment in ecological infrastructure is trying to create new ways of thinking about, what is the cost of not doing this work, and then how do we actually gather our resources more communally or differently or so on into building better lives for everybody and new kinds of work. So we're busy developing a learning pathway for this kind of work and looking at the different dimensions of that. And this is the work that we're doing, also starting to do with UNICEF, opening up these in the YOMA platform, which is a youth marketplace initiative to build micro-credential learning pathways, and to work also with the Quality Council for Trade and Occupations to see whether we can't articulate these new learning pathways and new types of work and learning so that we can actually perhaps find these as yet undiscovered occupations, such as environmental monitors that look after our rivers, and recognize them for the important work that they are doing. So that's the kind of thing that we are talking about and trying to think about, building alternatives that we can carry back into these systems that are currently just seeming to fail us, and includingly with the basic logics that are framing them. So new social imaginaries is the last point. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Heila. Another fascinating presentation. So we are running a bit out of time. So with your indulgence, can we extend our session with 10 minutes? We started 10 minutes late. So if you break in half an hour, then we have a bit of time for our discussion to give some reflections and for everyone to ask questions. The next session starting at 5 o'clock, and it's the final plenary session. So back where we started this morning. All right. So if you need to leave before, just leave. But our next, not presenter, but our discussion, so what we've asked, what ANDA and AFD and the EU has asked is Patrick. So Patrick McSharry, who's sitting there, he has a very intimidating CV, just to say. So he is the chief data scientist at World Data Lab and a research professor at the Carnegie Mellon University, which I believe is based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Headquartered in Pittsburgh.
Okay.
You're based in Rwanda and Kigali, Rwanda.
So Patrick advises organizations such as the World Bank, OECD, and the Global Partnership for Artificial Intelligence, the Mastercard Foundation, the Google Foundation, etc., you name it. Huh? He has published over 100 peer-reviewed papers and 3 books, including The Big Data Revolution from 2015. He holds a PhD in mathematics from Oxford University and is currently building multidisciplinary partnerships to create data-driven and sustainable solutions to global challenges. Wow, what a CV. So no wonder we've asked Patrick to just reflect a bit on the presentation. So 10, 12 minutes, and then we open up for questions. So please keep your questions for now. Patrick, over to you.
Thank you. Can only go downhill from here.
So first of all, I'm not an economist. I'm not a labor economist. So I'm definitely out of my comfort zone. So I need to tell a little bit of a story as to how I've ended up here. So I've been working with World Data Lab for about the last year, and we have a number of projects that are relevant to the discussion here. The first one is MasterCard Foundations. So we basically bring data to life. So very much like the Youth Explore dashboard that you saw there. So we've been doing lots of work like that, where we track the Sustainable Development Goals, where we take bits of data from different places, we impute, we fill gaps, we use artificial intelligence, machine learning, many different techniques to try and make sense of that data. And I guess one of the things I'm very interested in is not just looking at the past, but trying to figure out how do you predict into the future? How do you kind of, in a way, tell the story of, if we just keep going the way we're going, business as usual, this is where we're going to get to. We have a project with ILO, we're looking at social protection. And in a way, it's one of those very sad topics where everyone's like, yeah, we're not going to hit the target. We're just going to keep going. But in a way, by projecting into the future, you can see how far off the target you're going to be. And that, in a way, is the scary reality of actually getting action around the data. So data is a bit dull, it's a bit boring, right, until you start visualizing it. So what gets me out of bed in the morning is trying to figure out how to visualize the different data sets. I made some notes on the papers before I came here. I've made lots of notes here which I probably can't even read, so I'm not going to bore you by reading through all the pieces. I'm just going to try and pull together some of the highlights and maybe some of the connections between what I've seen. So, you know, the first talk that we saw was very, very detailed, where you were digging into inside cities, very, very high spatial resolution. We saw how you can take temperature data sets and then you can look at the temperatures in terms of informal settlements, and in terms of how we've seen temperatures going up, and we've seen also that urbanization is increasing, and we've seen that, kind of interestingly, we've seen that there's more green in certain places. I think, unfortunately, a lot of other parts of the world, we're seeing that arable land is replacing forestry, so we're losing that carbon sink. And that data obviously gave rise to a very clear message that we have more inequality. We've got just new types of inequality, a spatial inequality that's starting to develop. And of course, you start off with a form of inequality and you just see it being propagated and expanded. And we could see that dimension on some of the other talks I saw earlier today, where, you know, for example, green jobs, and you look at how green a job is, and it turns out that females are underrepresented in green jobs. And okay, why is that? Because again, you know, the female population don't have access to as many of the white collar jobs. So it's all kind of something that was there already, it just gets magnified. Then the second talk by Ariane on NEAT profiles, some of the really quite shocking statistics by just how much of a problem that NEAT group is. And I think what was really interesting is trying to figure out how to profile that, how to segment it, how to break down and understand what exactly is driving this and what are the trends through time. I'm blown away by how amazing the data is here, because I've been working with job data for youth in 7 other countries in Africa, and just trying our best. And thanks to the ILO, we have all of that data being brought together, but we often have data that's a few years out of date. We have data that is different in different places, so you end up never being too sure what the source of truth is, which is a real problem for me as a mathematician who, you know, likes to believe that the numbers tell us everything. The other talk in terms of that dashboard, again, that's really, you know, just singing, you know, from the same song sheet that I like to sing from, which is, if you don't have a dashboard and you just give people spreadsheets, you give people PDFs, they're probably not going to read it. And anyone who's got kids and knows where we're heading with that, if it's not on TikTok, you're probably not going to have anyone actually soaking any of it in. So bringing this stuff into images and bringing it into more concise and allowing people to interact and play with it, I think is really critical. So one of the things, kind of a pitch for us, we're building a jobs clock for MasterCard Foundation using the data from the 7 countries. We're doing deep dives in a number of those countries. So it's great to kind of see kind of what you've been doing here and how far we could push that if we did have the data in place. And then the final talk from Heila, just brilliant again, seeing the pulling apart of this problem of skills and skills development, and what does it really mean when you say that someone has a job, which is a great conversation I've had many times at some of the folk that I live in Nairobi. A lot of people don't believe that the job that we would think about, and this, I guess, ILO, you have to ask that question. You count jobs. So suddenly to kind of go, well, all these jobs are slightly different, and some of them aren't really jobs. So if I think about Uber drivers who double up and do a whole bunch of other things, those questions and being forced to say yes or no, we end up with imperfect data. And I like the point you were saying that it's maybe more about opportunities, income earning opportunities. MasterCard Foundation are very focused on dignified and fulfilling jobs, and we're spending a lot of time trying to operationalize that. So we can obviously look at informal, formal. I think one of the plugs maybe for World Data Lab is that we have data at a household level that we then integrate up to figure out how much spending do you have, and we can break down spending by age, by gender. We can go subnational with that data. We can also use trade data to figure out how much are you spending on different products. So some of the clients that we have, like L'Oreal, Nestle, who are really focused on certain products, they care about spending, but they really care about, are you going to be buying that beauty product? Are you going to be consuming that beverage? So the data, I think, is coming together through the use of predictive analytics and AI. And what I've seen here is that we've got lots of really interesting data in different places. We've got some very complex problems, but unless we can figure out how to share the data, bring it together, and focus on some really big, important questions, it's going to be difficult to change the world. And I started off my career as a physicist working on complex systems. My PhD's in chaos theory, so I'm very interested in that multidisciplinary aspects of this. So I think it's natural to feel you're outside your comfort zone, but if you can bring people together and find out how you speak the same language, then I think we can make progress. And so I wanted to highlight maybe a few pieces here. And one was that I think when you start looking at limited amounts of data, you can track the past. You can start doing some of the regressions. We had the odds regression where you can figure out, who and what are the conditions. So we had basically explaining some of the inequalities and some of the problems. But as you get more and more information, you end up with hundreds or maybe thousands of features. And then I think this is where, I wouldn't say it's AI, but where machine learning can be really useful, because we can build nonlinear, more complicated models, but we need to be really careful that we're not overfitting. So I think there's a lot of work where we understand the past, but we don't quite know whether that past is going to generalize to the future. And policy making, maybe starting off where I began, it's about building sensible scenarios that tell what the future is going to look like, and then kind of pulling back and being able to say, if we pull the lever in this way, we're most likely to move in a direction that we want to, but we know that there's a lot of uncertainty as we go forward. So want to say thank you to everybody for the amazing talks. I know there's now going to be a whole series of questions about the talks. Will you handle those questions, or do you want me to try and? Or I can, now that I'm here. And again, any questions in terms of, as I mentioned, partnerships, collaboration, sharing of data, getting around the fact that people don't want to share data because we've got amazing privacy laws, which are really important, but it means that the rewards of sharing the data are not so obvious and the risks are really obvious, so it's easier to say no. So I want to open the floor to what people thought of the 4 talks and what other things we could do. Oh. See how we do, yeah. So we start off with 3 questions and you've got the microphones to run around. So we've got a question here. Did I see another hand up somewhere else? No, just 2 questions in the first round then. Unless anyone wants to do a third?
Thank you very much. I'm Dudusbia from Mpumalanga province. It's not a question per se, but it's just comment. I think somehow, now we do see the value of research connecting to the real issues that are happening on the ground. With this, with the Youth Explorer, And then we had an opportunity of presenting it in Mpumalanga. Now the municipality, they see a value of it because they're developing all these policies. And then now with the IDP, this youth information is going to be carried so that each and every person that comes in, they will know where do you really need to intervene positively. I would really encourage most of the people just to go through it. And at the same time, we want to sort of like update it on a weekly or sort of annual basis to add some of the information that we never had. So somewhere, somehow, with the skill one, thank you so much for that information. We have programs. I normally say we have to look at the bottom-up approach. And it's where we could find a lot of interventions that could work as a jobs skill program. We have the program that called Catch Them Young. Is coming from the community. They bring all the young children and then they start teaching them that. So somewhere, somehow, this kind of program would really like to have a partnership with you to say, how can we bring it up to that kind of a level? So it's so far the comments that we can say.
So I'll go now. Okay. Yeah, so this was, I guess, for Jan and also Ariane. So looking at the kind of visualization of the Youth Labor Markets Index. Yeah, so first I just love the Youth Explorer, so it's very cool to have a nice demonstration of it. The one thing I was wondering about is how it's not just Northwest, but Gauteng also seems to have a very low Youth Labor Market Index. And I imagine that that's because there are jobs in Gauteng, so people migrate there, and then it has a high unemployment rate. And it just seems somewhat I don't know, it's somewhat counterintuitive that Gauteng or presumably Joburg, if you zoom in, is going to have a pretty bad index, when it's probably because there is quite a by South African standards, dynamic labor market there. And so I was wondering if I guess maybe it would be a different indicator because it is still useful to show what you're showing now, but to incorporate, I think you mentioned that national treasury data, which has the number of jobs in each area, and then the they have that spatial tax data.org.za website where they have their own dashboard now, and it shows, and it'd just be a useful complementary measure to see, is it because the labor market there is poor because there are no jobs, or because there's just a lot of young people in that area?
Thanks. So we could actually even show you the tax data that we do have on the Youth Explorer, and then you could see that. So we haven't yet delved into why exactly we're seeing the numbers yet that we do for the YLMI. I was just going to look through here quickly, but I haven't found it yet. We're breaking down the index into the various components for each province, and then you can identify which domain is driving the index score for Gauteng. So I've got it here in the paper. We didn't have a chance to cover it. And I'm glad you love the Youth Explorer. And look forward to the Community Explorer, which is forthcoming.
Thank you so much. I'm Jody from Western Cape Government. I'm working in the Climate Change Directorate. So firstly, I just want to acknowledge the first presentation. I think was really great. Also just illustrating that spatial inequality component. A lot of where our segregated areas are, they're also far from economic hubs, which I think linked quite nicely to the youth component. And I just to touch on the one point that you mentioned around, there seems to be an inability of youth to connect with opportunities. So maybe if you can just dive a bit deeper into that, because I know, for example, the one major one, sort of from even lived experience, is transport, and it was mentioned in the third presentation as well. But just diving a bit deeper into that, because that's actually how people are able to access these opportunities. But they're now so far away. And you can't even afford a taxi, a bus, a train, that type of thing. So any commentary on that? Thanks.
got 2 minutes. 2 minutes, so yeah.
No, but we can continue until 22. That's
Oh, 22, okay, yeah.
So if there
Yeah.
more questions.
Did someone wanted to respond to that? Did anyone want to respond, or yeah?
I was going to hand over to you because I think you should maybe pull up the data.
No, I don't have the answer ready. I'm going to take that as on advisement.
We all work together, right? So we're just trying to ping pong. Yeah, I mean, so we know, as you were saying, right, and Jo touched upon it in her presentation, we know there's various barriers to accessing employment and even to job search among these young people, right? So even when we can show that there are huge proportions actually of these young people who are willing to work and who are looking for work, we know that they're not necessarily looking for work in the most efficient ways because they may not have access to the information they need on how to look for work. They may not know where to find what opportunities are available within their immediate environment. There's a lot of work being done within the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention to try and consolidate the information that there is on opportunities, but even then we know that it continues to be a struggle for young people, and even when they know where opportunities are, as you say, they may not be able to get there because transport costs are high, data costs are high, clothing costs are high. You need certain clothes to go and interview for a particular job. So we know that all these barriers exist. What we don't necessarily have is what the barriers look like at that local level, because the data doesn't really allow us to go. So if you look at the Youth Explorer, you can see the different indicators. So you will be able to see what's the proportion of young people living in households where no one else is employed in that same area where youth unemployment is high and where NEET rates are high. So not having someone in your household who is employed means you don't have access to the kind of knowledge and information about how to engage with the labor market, and it also means your income will be lower to begin with. So you can kind of puzzle that information together from the different indicators that are there. That's one, but what the Explorer also does have is an indication, and I think that's where I want to hand over to Arindam. We didn't show it, but so the anti-SARS based indicators shows you where full-time, it's not a full picture because we don't have the full picture, but where full-time formal equivalent job opportunities are. And I don't know whether we want to quickly show you that so that you can see how you can access that, because it tells you exactly that picture of where young people live, but where the opportunities are is not necessarily the same place. I don't know whether you want to.
No, I don't have to. Thanks. No, so I do believe there is a strong requirement for adding the layer of public transportation, which, well, you work in the government and we know the data, it's like it's in shambles. And people aren't being able to access the jobs even if they are there, right? That's this thing. There's the travel survey that came out a couple of years back. Case in point, the ones who are worst off are spending the most amount per kilometer to get to work, right? If they have work. And just imagine the people who, we know the unemployment situation, and people looking for work have to spend so much more to even get to places to look for work, right? So I think I like the, I must thank you, Patrick, that term of propagating across other dimensions. I think that was the first time I heard that verb being used in terms of inequality. I like that. Yeah, it's one of those, it's a multiplicative effect.
And I think we've got a live demo appearing. Shall we take one question while we're waiting for you to dig into the dashboard? Especially if it's about the dashboard. So I think there's a question over here. Did I miss anyone? Anyone else put a hand up? I don't. We've got one there. Who was going first?
Thank you so much for the presentations. Really enjoyed them. Again, we'll echo the Youth Explorer is amazing. I guess I have a question more broadly about the category we use for youth, the 18 to 35 category, just the conceptualness of it. for two reasons. First, I would imagine you mentioned contextual interventions. An intervention for a 19-year-old unemployed person is very different compared to a 34-year-old unemployed person, given everything else held constant. And so wondering the value of clumping everyone in one category. And the second is just broadly from the broader social scientists, quite a push for the recognition of youth as a social category. That's sort of a liminal space between adulthood and childhood, and the inability of access to work as a failure to bridge that gap, and how that kind of discourse shapes how we speak about youth. I guess I'd be really curious, about how you are all thinking about that working in that field. Thank you.
People a few seconds to think about it. Did you want to say something specifically about?
Sorry, just responding to the question about the employment opportunities using the NT-SARS data. So this is Arindam's forte.
So that's just showing hotspots of where the jobs are. You can drill down by sector and so on. So I mean, I encourage you to just go onto the platform. You can go into the metros and drill down all the way. Like that's showing you the number of full-time employees, and you can drill down by sector and so on and so forth. It's like quite detailed. Oh, so this data is extracted from the tax filed by companies, right? So basically the tax returns filed by companies. So what it does, it creates an equal area hexagon from the postal code or the street address of each file, tax filing form. So basically that IRP5 form. So using the postal codes, it generates equal area hexagons for the metros. Now it's this particular deep dive at the intra-city level, so to say, is only for the metros, the 8 metros. The rest of the country is available at the municipality level.
Are you gonna answer that question?
I will respond to you just now, but I also just to say that if we are available to set up more deep dive presentations on the portal if people have questions around, because it does become, there's multiple layers of data. So we are available to set up seminars or information sessions. Joe, if you go to an indicator on the map view, anyone really will show you, Zach, the information is available for the full youth population. So we use both the South African definition 15 to 35, and that is a historically determined definition, right? Because South Africa assumes that, exactly as you're pointing out, it takes a longer time to transition out of youthhood, given the historical inequalities and imbalances that were put in place. So there is a broader definition in South Africa than there is internationally. The international youth definition is 15 to 24. But you're right, when we look at for instance, that NEET cohort, if you look at what its composition is for 15 to 19-year-olds, it's different from the 24 to 35-year-olds. So what the best we can do on the Explorer is to give you the breakdown. So when you choose an indicator, you can select with the filter down there whether you want to look at the youngest cohort, and so the heat map will change depending on what subcategory you select. You can look at 15 to 19-year-olds, or you can look at 15 to 35-year-olds and the subcategories that are there, because it's exactly as you say, there's a huge difference, and we can't just lump them together. So when you think about an intervention, it is important to have a look at what subcategory you're looking at. There's a whole sociological definition about, or this debate around this transition from childhood to adulthood and what it means to be stuck in waithood for many young people, but maybe we need to have a separate conversation about that. That's
Brilliant, thank you. I think in the interest of time, we probably do need to stop here. I know there's, if it's a very quick and easy one.
quick and easy one.
Yeah.
I'll keep it down. Just thanks again for the Youth Explorer. I'm from Year Beyond. We use it on a regular, so much appreciated. What I found quite interesting tangentially to the transport issue is the access to just applying for opportunities. So with portals like the SA Youth Portal, Harambee, all of that is accessed online. And then transport doesn't even become your biggest barrier. It's connectivity access to a device. So measuring aspects around cellular network connectivity, what is the cell phone, penetration rate within the households also becomes quite an important variable, because we know most households have access to at least one smartphone in metro areas, but what happens in, your peri-urban areas and, your rural areas where there's no cell phone connectivity, where there's no devices. So young people don't even have to seek by taking transportation routes. They can do it online, but if they don't even have access to that, they can't even access the marketplace.
Yeah, and in fact, does everyone know about UCLA? Every time you test the speed of your phone, you are basically sending a piece of data to an organization called UCLA, who we work with. We've built an internet poverty index at a national scale, but you could go subnationally. There's also a feedback button here, so anyone who's got more interesting questions, is the wonderful thing about Dashboard. But thank you, everybody, so much, and I think we need to move back to the main auditorium. Thank you.
Yeah, just very quickly, thank you to Arindam, Ariane, Joe, Heila, and Patrick. Yeah, I think this was a fascinating session. I think, it's mind-blowing how much information we are getting over these few days. So next session is at 5 o'clock in the auditorium, so there should still be a bit of time for coffee. Huh? So thanks a lot.